She arrived in Wyoming with two little girls, a carpet bag, and a name nobody wanted to speak out loud. They called her the Debt Bride, sold by her own father to settle money he owed a stranger. The town laughed. The rancher barely looked at her, and the most powerful man in the valley was already making plans to take everything before she even unpacked her bags. What nobody counted on, not the townspeople, not the rancher, not the land baron who thought he owned the entire frontier, was that Abigail Mercer didn't know how to disappear. If this story grabs you from the first word, stay with me until the very end. Hit that like button. Drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see just how far this story travels. The train smelled like coal smoke and wet wool, and the particular kind of despair that settles into a person when they've been traveling too long with nowhere good to go. Abigail Mercer sat in the last car, the cheapest seats, the ones closest to the engine noise and farthest from the dining berth, with her younger daughter asleep across her lap and her older daughter pressed against the window, watching the Wyoming landscape flatten out into something vast and unfamiliar and vaguely threatening. "Mama," Clara said. She was 9 years old and already had her mother's habit of asking questions that didn't have clean answers. "What does he look like?" "I don't know." "You've never seen a picture?" "No." "Did Papa know him?" Abigail shifted Ruth's weight. 6 years old, dead asleep, one shoe half falling off, and looked out the window past her daughter's reflection. The grass out there went on forever, pale gold and still, interrupted now and then by a line of fence posts that seemed to belong to nothing and no one. "No," she said. "Papa didn't know him." Clara turned from the window. She had her father's eyes, Thomas's eyes, that particular shade of gray-green that Abigail still wasn't entirely used to seeing on a child's face. "Then how did Papa pick him?" Abigail didn't answer that. She couldn't. Not honestly. Not in a way that a 9-year-old could carry without it breaking something in her. The truth was simpler and uglier than anything a child should have to understand. Her father, not Thomas, not her dead husband, but her own father, Harold Whitmore, had picked Silas Boone out of a letter written by a man Abigail had never met, sent to a man she wished she'd stopped trusting years before it mattered. And the arrangement had been finalized over a debt, $340 that Harold owed to a merchant in Cheyenne, a debt Silas had somehow agreed to absorb in exchange for a wife. Not a wife he'd courted, not a wife he wanted, a wife who came with 2 daughters and a widow's wardrobe and no particular skills that applied to ranch life. Abigail had found out 6 weeks after Thomas died. She'd been in the middle of sorting through his belongings, still moving slowly, the way grief makes you move, like walking through something thick, when her father had appeared at the door of the house they rented in Harrisburg and told her, almost casually, the way a man mentions weather, that he'd made arrangements. Arrangements. "You can't," she'd said. "It's already done." "I have children, Papa." "He knows." "I don't know this man." Harold Whitmore had looked at her in the particular way he had always looked at her. Not cruelly, but with a kind of fundamental indifference, the way a man looks at a piece of furniture he's decided to move to another room. "You don't have income, Abigail. You don't have property. The house is rented. You've got $30 in the savings envelope and 2 children to feed. I found you a solution." "You've found yourself a solution," she'd said. He hadn't disagreed. The station at Harlan Creek was smaller than Abigail expected. A single platform, a weather depot building, 3 men standing in varying arrangements of boredom and suspicion. She stepped off the train with Ruth half asleep on her hip and Clara holding the carpet bag with both hands, and she stood on that platform for a moment just trying to orient herself. The wind hit immediately, clean and cold and completely indifferent to her presence. One of the 3 men was watching her. She could feel it before she turned to look. When she did, she found a man in his late 30s standing slightly apart from the others, hat in hand, expression unreadable. He was taller than she'd imagined. She wasn't sure why she'd imagined anything. She had nothing to base it on. With a jaw that looked like it had been set hard at some point and never fully relaxed since. Dark hair going gray at the temples. A coat that had been good quality once, probably 5 or 6 years ago. He walked toward her like a man who had made a decision he wasn't sure about and had decided to carry it out anyway. "Mrs. Mercer," he said. It wasn't a question. "Mr. Boone." They looked at each other for a moment with the particular awkwardness of two people who have been thrust into a situation that neither of them designed and both of them resent. He looked at Ruth first, then at Clara, then back at Abigail. His expression didn't exactly soften, but something in it shifted. Some internal recalibration she couldn't quite read. "I have a wagon," he said. "All right. It's about 40 minutes. All right." He reached for the carpet bag. Clara pulled it back instinctively, and there was a half-second where everyone froze. The man, the child, Abigail. Before Clara looked up at her mother with a question in her eyes. Abigail gave a small nod. Clara released the bag. Silas Boone carried it to the wagon without another word. The 40 minutes felt longer. The road from Harlan Creek to the ranch wound through country that was simultaneously beautiful and bleak. Wide open sky, the distant smear of mountains still snow-capped in late spring, grassland that rolled and dipped and went on longer than seemed reasonable. Every now and then a fence line, a dry creek bed, a hawk hanging motionless over something invisible in the grass. Clara sat in the back of the wagon with Ruth, who had woken up enough to be confused but not enough to ask questions. Abigail sat up front beside Silas, which was where propriety suggested she should be and where she would have preferred not to be. He didn't say much. She didn't either. What was there to say that wouldn't immediately reveal how entirely unprepared they both were for this? After about 20 minutes, he said, without looking at her, "You should know what you're coming into. Tell me." "The ranch is struggling. I don't want you to arrive thinking it's something it isn't." "What is it?" He was quiet for a moment, watching the road. "It's 400 acres that should be producing a lot more than it is. 3 ranch hands, one of them's old and can't do what he used to, one of them's reliable, one of them drinks more than he works. A house that needs repairs I haven't had time to make. And debt." He said the last word flatly. "There's debt." "How much?" He told her. The number was large enough that Abigail felt it land somewhere in her chest. "What's the debt from?" she asked. "Loans, 2 of them, from about 3 years ago, when we had a drought and I lost most of the cattle. I took the loans to rebuild the herd, and the interest has been—" He stopped. "It's been harder to service than I expected." "Who holds the loans?" "A man named Gideon Cross. He runs a land company out of Cheyenne, but he's been operating in this valley for years." The name meant nothing to her yet. She filed it away. "Does he know you've brought a wife?" she asked. Silas's jaw tightened slightly. "He knows everything that happens in this valley." "What?" The ranch was called the Boone Quarter, a name that felt both modest and slightly defiant. The house was a 2-story frame construction that had been, at some point, someone's genuine effort. Good bones, decent proportions, a front porch with posts that still stood straight. But years of weather and neglect had done damage. One shutter hung at an angle. The porch boards had soft spots she'd have to watch for. The kitchen garden was entirely dead. She stood in front of it with Ruth on her hip and Clara beside her and looked at it the way a person looks at a problem they've decided to solve rather than a situation they've decided to flee. "It needs work," she said. "Yes." "What's the roof like?" Silas looked at her. Something in the question seemed to surprise him. She could see it register. "It held through winter," he said. "Mostly." "Mostly," she repeated. "There's a bucket in the upstairs bedroom," he said, with something that might have been the beginning of embarrassment. "Northeast corner." She nodded. "All right." He was still watching her, and she wasn't sure what he'd expected. Tears, maybe, or protest, or the kind of brittle collapse that people sometimes perform when reality arrives differently than imagined. She didn't have energy for any of those. She had 2 daughters and a carpet bag and a bucket in a corner, and those were the materials she had to work with. "Is there supper?" Clara asked. Practical, like her mother. Silas Boone looked at the 9-year-old for a moment, and something crossed his face that Abigail couldn't quite name. "Yes," he said. "I can make supper." He could make supper in the same technical sense that you could say a man could ride a horse. The basic mechanics were there, but the result was not going to impress anyone. Beans from a can, cornbread that was slightly raw in the middle, coffee that was more suggestion than substance. Ruth ate without complaint because she was 6 and hungry. Clara ate with the careful politeness of a child who has been taught manners and is choosing to apply them to difficult circumstances. Abigail ate because she needed to. The 3 of them, Silas at the head of the table, Abigail across from him, the girls between, managed approximately 11 minutes of silence before Clara said, "Do you have any animals?" "Cattle," Silas said. "About 60 head." "Do they have names?" "No." Clara seemed to consider this. "Can I name them?" "Clara," Abigail said quietly, "I just thought—" "You can name them," Silas said. Clara looked at him. He wasn't smiling exactly, but his face had done the thing again. That slight shift, some internal adjustment. "They won't know their names," he added, "but you can name them." Clara considered this with the gravity of someone accepting a significant responsibility. "I'll start tomorrow," she said. Ruth had fallen asleep in her chair by the time supper was done, her cheek against her arm, beans mostly eaten. Abigail carried her to the room Silas had prepared. Small, with a narrow window and a bed that had clean sheets, which she had not expected and found she was grateful for in a way that embarrassed her slightly. When she came back downstairs, Silas was at the kitchen table with a stack of papers in front of him, a lamp pulled close. He didn't look up when she came in, and she wasn't sure whether that was good manners or indifference. She poured herself the last of the terrible coffee and sat down across from him. He looked up. "I want to understand the debt," she said. A long pause. "Why?" "Because I'm here now." She kept her voice level. "I'm not here to keep house and stay out of the way. I'm here because my father sold me to settle his own debt, which means the least I'm entitled to is understanding what I've actually walked into." She paused. "Mr. Boone, I don't know you. You don't know me. But we have daughters to think about." "They're your daughters," he said. "Yes, and they're sleeping in your house, so—" She set down the coffee cup. "Show me the papers." Another pause. Longer this time. He looked at her across the table in the lamplight the way a man looks at something he's trying to decide whether to trust. Then he pushed the stack toward her. She sat with those papers for 2 hours that first night, after Silas had gone to bed and the house had settled into its particular late-night silence. The creak of the boards, the wind against the windows, the distant complaint of cattle somewhere out in the dark. The numbers were bad. She'd expected bad, but this was a specific kind of bad that bothered her more the longer she looked at it. The original loan terms, 2 loans 3 years ago, exactly as he'd said, had been straightforward enough. Standard interest, standard repayment schedule. Difficult, but manageable. But somewhere between the original paperwork and the current statements, something had changed. She found it first in the interest rate. The original contract stated 7% annually, but the current statements, the ones coming from Gideon Cross's land company every month, were calculating at 11. She went back and read the original contract again, slowly, looking for an amendment clause. Found one, buried in the 3rd page, in language that was dense enough to make her eyes water. Rate subject to adjustment at holder's discretion upon 60 days written notice. Not to exceed, not to exceed. She looked for the ceiling, couldn't find one. She pulled the stack of monthly statements and laid them out in order. March 1880 through March 1883. She went through them one by one. The rate hadn't changed overnight. It had crept. 7% to 7.5%, then 8%. Then a jump to 9.5%, then 11%, where it had stayed for the last 14 months. She sat back in her chair and looked at the ceiling. This wasn't an accident. Yet, she didn't mention it the next morning. There were too many other immediate problems. Ruth needed boots that actually fit, one of them having split at the sole somewhere between Harrisburg and Wyoming. The kitchen needed to be organized in a way that made functional sense. The garden needed to be assessed before planting season passed entirely. Silas left early with his ranch hands, the reliable one, whose name was Pete, and the old one, whose name was Hector, and the drinking one, whose name was Danny, and who showed up with red eyes and a general air of barely managing. She watched the 3 of them ride out from the porch with coffee in her hand and assessed the situation with the same methodical attention she'd been applying to the loan paperwork. They were short-handed, that was obvious. 3 men for 400 acres and 60 head of cattle was not enough, and one of the 3 men was a liability. She found the property map in the study, a room that had been, she suspected, not entered in some time, based on the dust and the general atmosphere of abandonment, and spread it on the desk. The property was long and narrow, bounded on the east by a creek that was probably useful, and on the west by land that belonged, according to the notations in the margin, to a family called Abernethy. She noted that the notation said Abernethy, see Cross Land Company, re pending. She wasn't sure what that meant yet. She wrote it down. Booked. The town of Harlan Creek was the kind of small western town that had opinions about everything and kept track of everything and spoke its opinions in the spaces between what it said out loud. Abigail walked into the general store on the third day, Ruth on one hand and a list in the other, and felt the shift in the room before she'd cleared the doorway. The woman behind the counter, heavy-set, 50s, with the particular expression of someone who has decided in advance what kind of person you are, looked her up and down with a deliberateness that wasn't even pretending to be subtle. "You're the Boone woman," she said. "Abigail Mercer," Abigail said. "I married Silas Boone." The woman began moving things on the counter for no apparent reason. "He finally got someone to take the arrangement." Abigail put her list on the counter. "I need these things." The woman read the list. "You planning to replant the garden?" "Yes." "It's late in the season." "I know. Silas let that garden go 2 years ago. Before that, it was his mother's." Abigail looked at her. "Is his mother gone?" 3 years. The woman glanced up. "Same year as the drought. Hard year for this valley." A pause, loaded with something. "Hard year for some." There were 2 other women in the store pretending to look at fabric. They weren't looking at fabric. "I'd like to pay for the supplies," Abigail said. Ruth had found a jar of penny candy on a low shelf and was looking at it with the specific expression of a 6-year-old doing moral calculus. "Don't touch, please," Abigail said without turning. Ruth didn't touch. The woman behind the counter, her name, Abigail would learn later, was Mabel Cook, and she owned the store outright, which gave her an authority in Harlan Creek that she deployed without apology. Took her time filling the order. While she worked, she talked. Not to Abigail exactly, but in the general direction of the room. Of course, Silas has been struggling with those loans for a while. Everyone in the valley knows it. Cross has been, a slight pause, calibrated, patient with him. More patient than with some. Abigail paid for the supplies. She loaded them into her arms and Ruth's small ones, and she walked back out onto the street. And she didn't let her face do anything in particular until she'd gone half a block, and then she stopped in the middle of the road and breathed. Cross. The name again. She stood there a moment longer, breathing the Wyoming air, and then she made herself keep walking. Ubga. There were things she had not anticipated about Silas Boone. He was not unkind. She'd braced herself for worse, had spent the train ride constructing various versions of what she might be walking into, and he was not unkind. He didn't speak to her much, and when he did, it was usually practical. Something about the water pump, or a fence that needed repair, or what time supper ought to be. But he said please when he asked for things, and thank you when he got them. And he had, she noticed, put effort into preparing for the girl's arrival in ways he didn't mention, and probably thought she hadn't seen. There was a small drawing hung inside the bedroom where Ruth and Clara slept. A pencil sketch of a horse, framed in plain wood, hung at a height that made sense for a child. She hadn't asked about it. She suspected it had been put there specifically, and she suspected he would be embarrassed if she named it. He worked hard. This she could see clearly. He was up before her in the mornings, every morning, without exception, and she was not a late sleeper. He came in after dark most evenings with the particular exhaustion of a man who has been fighting something physical all day and is losing on points. One evening, about a week after her arrival, she set the loan papers on the table beside his supper. He looked at them, then at her. "I found something," she said, "in the interest calculations." He was quiet. "The original contract says 7%. You're being charged 11. She sat down. "The amendment clause is real. He has the legal right to adjust the rate. But the clause has a ceiling. It's written in language that's deliberately obscure, but it's there. Not to exceed the prevailing commercial rate plus 2 points. She slid a newspaper clipping across the table. She'd gone to the depot and asked for back issues until she found what she needed. The prevailing rate in Wyoming Territory right now is 8.5%, which means the legal ceiling is 10.5. She tapped the current statement. He's charging 11. He's over the limit, he said himself. Silas had stopped eating. He was looking at the papers. That's 1% over the ceiling, she said. On the size of your loans over 14 months, that's, she had done the math twice, approximately $230 you've overpaid. The sound he made was not quite a word. I could be wrong about the clause, she said. I'm not a lawyer, but I don't think I'm wrong. Silas was still looking at the papers. In the lamplight, something had shifted in his face, not in an easy direction, more like something that had been settled, that had arranged itself into a particular shape of defeat, being broken up and rearranged into something less settled, which is sometimes more painful than the defeat itself. I've been paying it, he said. I thought... He stopped. I thought it was legal. Maybe he thought you'd never check. A long silence. Gideon Cross, Silas said, and the way he said the name told her that there was a history there, a specific texture of history that she didn't fully understand yet. Tell me about him, she said. Silas looked up. He seemed to be deciding something, the way people decide whether to put something down that they've been carrying for a long time. Not because putting it down is easy, but because they've become too tired to keep holding it. He started talking. Gideon Cross had arrived in the Harlan Creek Valley about 12 years ago. Nobody was entirely sure where he'd come from. There were various stories, none of them consistent, but he'd come with money and a legal operation and the specific kind of confidence that people in small, struggling communities find either impressive or threatening, and very few find both simultaneously. He'd started with land purchases, legitimate ones at first, bought out 2 families who'd decided frontier life wasn't what they'd signed up for, paid fair prices, or what seemed like fair prices, built a house outside of town that was substantial enough to make a statement. Then the drought hit. 3 bad years in a row, 1878, 1879, 1880. Ranchers who'd been marginal became desperate. Cattle died. Water sources dried up. Families that had been here for 15 years found themselves with no option but to borrow. Cross had been there with the money, every time. Available, reasonably spoken, seemingly generous. The loan terms that he presented were, at the time of signing, reasonable. Slightly above market rate, but not outrageously so. And the amendment clause was in all of them. He did it to the Abernethys first, Silas said. That's the ranch next to mine. Walt Abernethy. He borrowed in '79 when his well went dry. Cross held the loan, kept adjusting the rate. By '81, Walt couldn't service the interest at all. Cross called the loan and took the property. He took the ranch, legal foreclosure, everything proper on paper. Silas's voice had the flat quality of someone reciting something they've spent time trying to understand and haven't been able to make peace with. Walt and his wife and their kids, 3 of them, they left for Colorado. House stood empty for a while. Now Cross is running cattle on it with hired men. Abigail looked at the property map she'd found. The notation? Abernethy, see Crossland Company, pending. The land next to Silas's eastern boundary. How many ranches has he taken? She asked. That I know of for certain. 4. That I suspect? More. Silas rubbed the back of his neck. The thing is, he never takes them all at once. It's slow. 1 family at a time, stretched over years. By the time you see the pattern, you're already in it. Does anyone talk about it? Some. Quietly. He looked at her. Cross has money, and he has lawyers, and he has men who are... He employs a lot of people in this valley. Ranch hands, businessmen, people who depend on him for one thing or another. You start talking too loud about Gideon Cross, and you find out how many people are listening for him. Abigail sat with that for a moment. Outside, the wind had picked up. She could hear it moving across the roof, finding the places where the shingles were loose. The overpayment, she said. The interest overcharge. If I'm right about the clause... It might not matter, Silas said. Even if we proved it, Cross has lawyers. We'd need to take it to a judge, and there's only one federal circuit that covers this territory. And the last time anyone tried to... He stopped. What happened? Nothing good. He looked at the table. Man named Cullen tried to dispute a loan term about 2 years ago. Formally, hired a lawyer, filed a motion. 3 weeks later, his barn burned. A pause. The fire marshal said it was an accident. Abigail absorbed this. I'm not saying Cross ordered it, Silas said carefully. I'm saying nobody knows. And nobody looked too hard. because they were afraid. Yes. She thought about her daughter sleeping upstairs, about the split sole on Ruth's boot that she'd repaired with leather she'd found in the barn, about Clara, who had already named 7 of the cattle and was working on an organizational system. She thought about her father, who had sold her to settle a debt and who had done it with the calm of a man moving furniture. She thought about how tired she was of being moved. "Show me all of it," she said. "Every piece of paperwork you have from Cross. Every statement, every letter, every contract. I want to see all of it." Silas looked at her across the table. Whatever he'd been expecting from this marriage, and she doubted it had been much, she was fairly certain it hadn't been this. "Why?" he said, not challenging, genuinely asking. "Because," she said, "nobody has looked at it carefully enough yet." Dutch. She went through it over the next 3 weeks. Every night after supper, after the girls were in bed, she sat at the kitchen table with the papers and the lamp and a notebook she'd bought in town. She made lists. She made timelines. She mapped the rate adjustments against dates, against seasons, against events she knew about, and events she was guessing at. Silas started staying up later. Not obviously, not in a way that announced itself, but she began to notice that when she came downstairs after putting the girls to bed, he was often still at the table, doing his own accounting or reading, and instead of going to bed, he'd stay, refill the coffee, sometimes ask a question about what she'd found. "The rate adjustments always came in certain months," she said one evening. "Look," she spread the timeline on the table. "Late winter or early spring, every time." Silas looked, right before planting season. When ranchers have the least cash available, they've spent the winter on reserves. They won't see revenue until fall. It's the hardest time of year to absorb an increase. He was quiet for a moment. "It's deliberate." "I think so." She watched him look at the pattern, watched him trace it with one finger, slowly, the way you trace something you're seeing clearly for the first time and don't entirely want to believe. "He picked the timing," Silas said. "Yes." "He knew when people would be least able to fight back." "Yes." Silas sat back in his chair. He didn't say anything. He had a way of going quiet that she was beginning to understand. It wasn't emptiness, it was processing, the way some people's faces go still when their minds are moving fast. "There are other ranchers," she said, "still in the valley, still holding Cross loans. If their paperwork shows the same pattern, we'd need them to share it," Silas said. "And most people are afraid, I know." She looked at him. "Are you afraid?" A pause. "Long enough to be honest." "Yes," he said. "But I'm also—" He seemed to search for the word angry. "For the first time in a while, I'm more angry than afraid." She understood that. She'd felt the shift herself somewhere in the second week of the paperwork. Fear was still there. She wasn't foolish enough to dismiss it. But it had been joined by something harder and hotter and more useful. "There are 3 other ranches," she said. "Still operating, still in debt to Cross. The Hallorans to the north, a man named Prescott about 8 miles east, and the widow Kane on the south pasture land." "You've been doing research." "In town, people talk." She didn't mention that she'd gone back to the general store 3 times and let Mabel Cook talk at her, following the threads carefully, drawing maps in her mind of who owed what to whom. If their loan terms show the same patterns, same clause, same rate manipulation, then this isn't an individual dispute. It's a scheme. Silas was looking at her again with that expression she couldn't entirely classify. The one that appeared when she said something that recalibrated whatever assumptions he'd arrived with. "You should talk to them," she said. "You know them. I don't. Not yet. They might not want to get involved." "Then they won't. But they should know what's in their own contracts." He was quiet for a moment more. Then he stood up, gathered the papers into a careful stack. She noticed he'd learned to be careful with them, which he hadn't been at first, and looked at her. "All right," he said. It wasn't a dramatic moment. It wasn't a speech. He didn't seem to be performing resolve. He just made a decision, the way a tired and uncertain man sometimes does when someone else has handed him a reason to stop doubting. She went back to her notebook. Outside, the Wyoming wind moved across the roof of the Boone Quarter ranch house, finding the same loose shingles it always found, making the same complaint it always made. Somewhere in the dark, 60 cattle whose names Clara had been carefully assigning stood in the spring grass. The lamp burned low, and Abigail Mercer kept writing. Silas came back from the Halloran Ranch on a Tuesday afternoon looking like a man who had walked into a wall he hadn't seen coming. Abigail was in the garden, a word she was using loosely, since at this stage it was mostly turned earth and optimism, when she heard the wagon. She stood up, brushed dirt from her hands, and watched him drive in. His face told her something before he got down. "Well," she said. He climbed off the wagon and tied the horse and didn't answer immediately, which was its own kind of answer. "Silas, their rate is 12%, he said. He said it quietly, the way people say things that are worse than they expected. They've been paying 12% for 8 months. Abigail stood very still. "Their ceiling. Same clause as mine, near word for word." He pulled a folded paper from his coat pocket. "Tom Halloran let me copy it out. He didn't want to at first. His wife had to talk him into it. He kept saying he didn't want trouble. He's already in trouble. I told him that." Silas looked at the paper in his hand. "He knows. He just doesn't see a way out that doesn't make things worse." She took the paper and read it standing there in the garden with dirt on her hands. The clause was, as Silas said, nearly identical to his own. The same obscure language, the same adjustment framework, the same missing ceiling that wasn't actually missing if you read it carefully enough. And the Halloran's current rate was clearly, demonstrably above whatever that ceiling allowed. "Did you see their statements?" she asked. "Some. Enough." "Same timing on the increases?" He nodded. "February 2 years running." She looked at the paper a moment longer, then folded it and put it in her apron pocket. "I'll go see the Widow Kane tomorrow," she said. "Abigail?" "I know." She picked up her trowel. "I'll be careful what I say." He was quiet for a moment, watching her. There was something in the way he watched her sometimes that she hadn't decided what to do with yet. Not suspicion, not quite admiration, something in between those things that suggested he was still in the process of revising whatever conclusions he'd drawn about her when she'd stepped off the train. "Danny quit," he said then, almost as an afterthought. She looked up. Danny, the drinking ranch hand. "When?" "This morning. Said he found better work." Silas's expression was unreadable. "Said it with a new coat on his back, which he didn't have yesterday." She absorbed that. "Cross?" "I don't know. Maybe. Danny knew things about this ranch, the loan situation, the amounts. He was here when the first loan was signed." He paused. "I shouldn't have let him stay as long as I did." "No," she agreed. Then, because he looked like a man flagellating himself for something already done. "But he's gone now. We'll manage. With 2 men and 400 acres. And me," she said. "And Clara, who is shockingly effective with a fence post, as it turns out." Something shifted in his face. Not quite a smile. Something in the neighborhood of one. "She told Hector she was going to name the fence post, too. She mentioned it to me as well. I haven't yet decided whether to discourage it." He almost smiled properly then. It was the most animated she'd seen his face. He caught it and put it back somewhere, the way men do when they've spent a long time not having much to smile about, and the habit of it has worn thin. 2 men, he said, "and whatever help we can manage." "It'll be enough," she said. She wasn't entirely sure it was true. She said it anyway. The Widow Kane was not what Abigail expected, which she reflected was becoming a habit in Wyoming. Expecting one thing and finding another. Margaret Kane was 53, bone-thin, with the hands of someone who had been doing physical labor since before Abigail was born, and the eyes of someone who didn't have a great deal of patience left for things that wasted her time. She met Abigail at the door of her ranch house and looked at her without speaking for a long enough moment to be deliberate. "You're the Boone woman," she said. "The one from Pennsylvania." "Harrisburg, yes. Abigail Mercer." She'd kept her name. She'd signed the marriage as Abigail Mercer Boone and then stopped there. And if Silas had an opinion about it, he hadn't shared it. "I was hoping to talk with you about your loan with the Cross Land Company." Margaret Kane's expression didn't change exactly, but something behind it did. A kind of heightening, like a prairie dog coming up out of a hole to assess whether what it's hearing is wind or something with teeth. "Come inside," she said. The interior of the Kane ranch house was nothing like the Boone Quarter. It was ordered with a precision that felt almost military. Everything in its place, nothing wasted, the kind of organization that comes not from personality, but from decades of necessity. A woman alone on 400 acres didn't have the luxury of clutter. Margaret set coffee on the table. Real coffee, properly made, which Abigail received with the gratitude of someone who had been drinking Silas's version for 3 weeks, and sat across from her. "Talk," she said. Abigail talked. She laid out what she'd found in the loan paperwork, the rate, the clause, the ceiling, the pattern of adjustments timed to the hardest months. She did it plainly, without drama, the way she'd found the information itself, methodically, piece by piece, until the picture was assembled. Margaret listened without interrupting. When Abigail finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she stood up and went to a cabinet on the far wall, opened it, and removed a wooden box. She set it on the table and sat down again. "I've been keeping every paper he ever sent me," she said. "Every statement, every letter. My husband thought I was being obsessive." She opened the box. "He died 4 years ago, and I've kept right on doing it." Inside the box were papers, sorted by date and bound in small stacks with string. Abigail looked at them and felt something move in her chest, some combination of recognition and the particular kind of hope that is almost too fragile to name. "May I?" she asked. Margaret gestured. "Go ahead." It took 40 minutes to go through the box. Margaret sat across from her the entire time, refilling the coffee once, not speaking unless Abigail asked a question. The picture that emerged was worse than the Boone Quarter. Margaret Kane had borrowed in 1878, earlier than Silas during the first drought year, and had been servicing a cross loan for 5 years. The rate manipulation was the same pattern, but it had been running longer, more gradual, more carefully paced, a professional exercise in slow bleeding. "Your current rate," Abigail said without looking up. 13%, Margaret said. "The ceiling in your contract is 9.5. A silence. "I didn't catch that," Margaret said. Her voice was perfectly flat, the flatness of someone keeping a lid on something. "It's buried in the amendment clause. Same language as Silas's contract, Tom Halloran's contract. I'd need to see Prescott's paperwork to be sure, but I think it's the same across all of them." Abigail set down the papers. "Mrs. Kane, you've overpaid by—" "I would need to do the full calculation, but it's significant. Years of overpayment." Margaret was looking at the table. Her jaw was set in a way that communicated several things simultaneously, none of them soft. "He's been robbing me for 5 years, she said. "Systematically, and not just you." Abigail kept her voice steady. "There's a word for what this is when you look at all of it together. This isn't one man making aggressive loan decisions. This is a designed system for taking land from people while making it look legal." Margaret looked up. Her eyes were sharp and entirely dry. "What do you want to do about it?" "I don't know yet," Abigail said. "I need to see Prescott's papers. I need to look at the Abernethy foreclosure records, the ones that are public. I need to understand the full shape of it before I know what can be done." She paused. "But I needed to know if the pattern held across more than one ranch." "It does. It holds," Margaret said. She reached for her coffee and held it without drinking. "I'll tell you something else. The Abernethy foreclosure, 3 years ago, when Cross took that property. Walt Abernethy didn't just walk away. He filed a complaint with the county recorder." Abigail straightened. "He did?" "I know because Walt told me before he left for Colorado. He filed a formal complaint, documented everything he could, presented it to the recorder's office." She set the coffee down. "You know what happened?" "Tell me." "Nothing. Complaint was received and filed, and nothing. No investigation. No response." Margaret's mouth pressed into a thin line. "Walt said the clerk who took his complaint looked like a man being asked to jump into a river, because Cross has influence over the local authorities. Cross has money and men and a long memory, and not much that resembles conscience, Mrs. Mercer. In a territory this size, that's usually enough." Abigail sat with that for a moment. The kitchen of the Kane ranch house was warm and orderly and very quiet, and outside the wind moved across the prairie in its endless, indifferent way. "Then we need to go higher than the county," she said. Margaret looked at her across the table. "Federal? Federal marshal, federal court." Abigail said it carefully, because she was still building this thought as she spoke it, testing its weight. "If the pattern holds across 4 or more ranches, documented, demonstrable, the same clause manipulated the same way, that's not a local dispute." That's fraud. Conspiracy to commit fraud, potentially. The kind of thing federal authorities are supposed to care about. Margaret was quiet for a long moment. The kind of quiet that is made of thinking rather than doubt. Supposed to, she said. Yes, supposed to. I'm not making promises I can't keep. Abigail met her eyes. I'm telling you what I see in the paperwork. What I see is a pattern that is real and documented and damning if someone with the right authority looks at it. Whether someone with the right authority actually does, she stopped. I can't guarantee that. I won't pretend to. Margaret Kane looked at her for a long moment, the kind of assessment that a person runs when they've been disappointed before and are deciding whether to be disappointed again. You're not what I expected, she said finally. From the Boone woman. I'm not what anyone expected, Abigail said, including Silas. Something that might have been a small, dry approximation of a smile crossed Margaret Kane's face. Can I keep my box? Yes. I'll need copies of the most important documents, but you keep the originals. Abigail stood. You should put that box somewhere safe, somewhere not obvious. I'll move it tonight. No hesitation. A woman who had been operating alone for years understood practical security. The Prescott boy, you said you need his papers. He's skittish. His father died 2 years ago, and he's been managing the ranch since he was 19. He's not going to want to get involved. I know. Silas is going to talk to him. Send Silas soon. Cross's man was out at Prescott's last week. If he's about to call that loan... She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Abigail drove back to the Boone quarter with the weight of what she'd found sitting somewhere behind her sternum, heavy and specific. The evidence was real. The pattern was real. The scope of it was larger than she'd hoped, which meant it was also more provable than she'd feared. She told Silas over supper, all of it, including the Abernethy complaint that had gone nowhere, including Margaret's information about Cross's man at the Prescott Ranch. Silas put down his fork partway through and didn't pick it up again. He's moving on Prescott, he said. I think so. Luke's 21. If Cross calls that loan right now to spring before any cattle sales, I know. Abigail looked at him. Can you ride out to Prescott tomorrow? I'll go tonight if I have to. Tomorrow is fine, but early. She paused. When you talk to him, don't push. Just ask to see the paperwork. Let him look at it himself. You think seeing it changes how people feel about it? She thought about Tom Halloran's face when Silas had shown him the rate calculation. She thought about Margaret Kane, jaw set, 5 years of quiet overpayment converting itself into something harder and more purposeful in the time it took to go through a wooden box. Yes, she said. I think there's a difference between knowing something is wrong and seeing it written down in black and white. The paper makes it real in a different way. Clara had been listening to about half of this with the focused attention of a 9-year-old who knows she's not supposed to be listening. Ruth had given up entirely and was drawing horses on a piece of paper Abigail had given her. Mama, Clara said, with the specific tone that meant she'd been holding a question for a while. Is the man who's taking ranches bad? Abigail considered the question and the age of the person asking it. He's doing bad things, she said. Whether that makes him bad all the way through, I don't know enough about him to say. But he's hurting people. Yes? Then why doesn't someone stop him? Neither she nor Silas answered that immediately, and the silence of the gap sat in the kitchen with them for a moment. Ruth drew another horse, slightly better than the last one. That's what we're trying to figure out, Silas said finally. Clara seemed to accept this. She picked up her fork again and ate 3 more bites, and then said, entirely matter-of-factly, I named the 2 fences by the south pasture Violet and Josephine. I told Hector, and he said it was disturbing. Hector's opinion is noted, Abigail said. Luke Prescott was, as Margaret had predicted, skittish, a tall, angular young man with the look of someone who had aged about a decade in the past 2 years and was still catching up to it internally. He met Silas at the gate of his property and didn't invite him any further, which Silas had the sense to accept, holding his conversation there in the early morning light with his hat in his hands. He told Silas he didn't have time for trouble. Silas told him trouble had already found him, which was why Cross's man had been at his fence line last week. A silence. Luke Prescott looked at the middle distance. The way young men look at things when they're trying to decide whether what they're being told is the thing they've been afraid of or the thing that sounds like it. "What do you want?" he said. "To show you something in your own contract," Silas said. "That's all. You look at it yourself. You draw your own conclusions." Luke looked at him for another long moment, then turned and walked back toward the house without speaking, which Silas correctly interpreted as an invitation. It took 20 minutes. Luke Prescott had the contract. Just the contract. He hadn't kept the statements, a fact that made Silas's jaw tighten slightly on Abigail's behalf. And Silas walked him through the clause and the rate ceiling the way Abigail had walked him through it weeks before. Luke went very still when the number became clear. "He can't charge above that," he said. "Not a question. A man calculating whether what he's hearing is real. Not legally, not by the terms he wrote himself. I've been paying above that for—" Luke stopped, swallowed. Did math in his head that was probably wrong in the specifics and right in the general shape of it. "Since January. Most of us have been overpaying for longer." Silas kept his voice even. "Mrs. Mercer, my wife, she's been going through all of it. She's building the full picture, but she needed to know if your contract had the same clause." "It does." Luke was looking at the paper in a way that Silas recognized. The same look he'd had himself when Abigail had laid it out for him the first time, something reshaping behind the eyes. "What are we supposed to do about it? We're still working that out, but the first step was knowing what we were dealing with. Cross has lawyers." "He does." "He has men." "He does." Luke was quiet for a moment. "So do we," he said. It came out half uncertain, half stubborn, the voice of someone who is frightened and angry in approximately equal measure, and has just decided which one to let drive. Silas came home and reported this to Abigail, who was at the kitchen table with papers spread from one end to the other. She listened, and when he finished, she added Luke Prescott's name and rate information to the chart she'd been building. A long sheet of paper pinned to the table's edge, all 4 ranches laid out in columns with dates and rates and amounts. When you saw it laid out that way, all 4 of them together, the timing, the amounts, the shared language of the amendment clauses, it stopped looking like aggressive lending. It looked like what it was, a system. Designed, methodical, disguised in legal language, and executed over years with enough patience to make it look like the natural consequence of drought and hard times. Gideon Cross hadn't just been taking land. He'd been building a machine for taking land, and the machine had been running for at least a decade, and everybody in the valley had been too frightened or too isolated or too buried in their own immediate survival to see the whole shape of it. Abigail sat back in her chair and looked at the chart. She was not a lawyer. She was not a law enforcement officer. She was a widow from Harrisburg who had been sold into a marriage arrangement and arrived in Wyoming with 2 daughters and a carpet bag and $340 worth of debt she hadn't incurred. What she had was paper. What she had was pattern. What she had now was 4 ranchers who had seen their own numbers and were angry enough to say so, or would be when the time came. Whether that was enough, she didn't know. But she knew what the next step was. "We need someone who can actually do something with this," she said. "Federal authority. Someone who can investigate and has the power to act." She tapped the chart. "This is documented fraud across multiple properties over multiple years. That's not a local court matter." Silas was looking at the chart from across the table. He'd looked at it before, but she could tell he was seeing it differently now that Prescott's information was added, the 4th column filling in the last corner of the picture. "There's a federal marshal in Cheyenne," he said slowly. "Elias Grant. He's been in the territory 6 or 7 years. I don't know him personally, but his name comes up when people talk about—" He paused. "He's got a reputation for being straight. Straight meaning honest, or straight meaning inflexible?" "Honest," Silas said. "Or that's what people say. I couldn't tell you from personal experience." "Do you trust the people who say it?" He thought about it. "Pete does. Pete's been here 30 years and he doesn't say things like that about people easily. Pete, the reliable ranch hand, the one who'd stayed. Abigail had come to trust Pete's steadiness in practical matters, which meant she was inclined to extend that trust to his character assessments. "All right," she said. "Cheyenne. It's a 2-day ride. We'd need to bring the documentation, not copies, originals. The kind of thing a federal officer can actually look at, or review copies if the originals stay with the owners. She thought about Margaret Kane's box, now hidden somewhere that wasn't obvious. We'll need to think about how to transport them. If Cross finds out what we're doing before we get there, he will find out, Silas said. Eventually, the question is when. She looked at him. He said it simply, without performance. The flat acknowledgement of a man who'd been living in Cross's shadow long enough to understand how the man operated. Then we move quickly, she said, before we're ready, almost. Because waiting until we're fully ready is how he finds out first. The lamp flickered. Somewhere upstairs, one of the girls turned over in her sleep, the familiar creak of the bed that she'd come to recognize at night. Ruth sighed, the heavier sound. Silas was still looking at the chart. Then he looked at her. I want you to know something, he said. He said it carefully, the way he said careful things, with the deliberateness of a man who doesn't speak casually and isn't starting now. When my father built this ranch, it took him 20 years. I nearly lost it in 3. He paused. I'd made my peace with losing it. I thought the only thing left to do. She waited. I hadn't made my peace with it, he said. I just didn't see another option. He looked back at the chart. You found another option. She didn't say anything immediately. There wasn't a clean response to that. Nothing that was both true and adequate. We found it, she said finally. He almost disagreed. She could see it. Then he let it stand. She pulled the chart toward her and started making notes on what they'd need for Cheyenne. The list was practical. Documents, copies, the order of presentation, the names of witnesses willing to speak. She wrote it down in her careful, close handwriting while the lamp burned and Silas sat across from her, not leaving, turning a pen over and over in his fingers in the particular restless way of a man who has stopped being patient about something. The machine they were building was made of paper and truth, and the anger of 4 families who'd been quiet too long. She didn't know yet if it would be enough. She knew it was the only one they had. The plan came together the way most necessary things do. Not cleanly, not all at once, but in pieces, each one revealing the next problem that needed solving before the larger shape could be seen. They had 4 ranches documented. They had a chart that showed the pattern clearly enough that even a man with no legal training could look at it and understand what had been done to him. What they didn't have was the thing Abigail kept returning to in her thinking, the source, the original design, the proof that this wasn't aggressive but legal lending, interpreted uncharitably by people looking for someone to blame, but deliberate, premeditated fraud executed from the beginning with the specific intention of stealing land. The loan documents proved the overcharging. They didn't prove the intent. She was sitting with this problem on a Thursday morning, girls at the kitchen table with their lessons, Silas and Pete somewhere out on the south pasture, when Tom Halloran arrived at the door. She'd met him once before, briefly, when Silas had brought him by to look at the chart. He was a compact, weathered man in his 40s who seemed to spend a great deal of energy holding himself very still, as if stillness were a form of self-control he'd had to work at. His wife, Ellen, had come with him this time. Ellen Halloran had a face that had been pretty once and was now something better. Specific, expressive, marked by the kind of experience that softens some features and sharpens others. We heard something, Tom said, when Abigail had poured coffee, and the 4 of them were at the table. You should know about it. Tell me. Ellen set her cup down. My sister lives in Cheyenne. She's married to a clerk who works in the county recorder's office there. She paused, choosing words. He hears things. In his position, you hear things. What did he hear? That Gideon Cross is going to Cheyenne next week, Tom said. He goes twice a year, regular, to meet with his lawyers and manage business with the land company. He'll be gone at least 4 or 5 days. He looked at Abigail steadily. His estate will be mostly empty. He takes 2 of his men with him and leaves the rest on rotation across the properties he's running. The kitchen was quiet for a moment. You're telling me, Abigail said carefully, that his house will be accessible. I'm telling you what I heard, Tom said. He was still holding very still. What a person does with that information is their own business. Ellen Halloran was looking at Abigail with an expression that was direct and slightly frightened and completely resolved, all at the same time. His private papers are in that house, she said. The real ones, not what he sends to the banks or files with the courts. The working papers. My husband's brother did carpentry work at the estate 2 years ago. He said Cross has a private office in the East Wing that Cross locks himself. How does your brother-in-law know what's in it? He doesn't, but he knows Cross locked it whenever he left the room, even if it was just to step out to the porch. A man who does that is keeping something he doesn't want seen. Ellen said it simply, without drama. It was the logic of a woman who understood privacy and what it protected. Abigail was quiet for a moment, looking at her coffee cup. The shape of what was being suggested was clear enough. It was also, she was fully aware, illegal. Breaking into a private residence, entering without permission. The kind of thing that, if caught, would destroy not just the investigation but everyone involved in it. She thought about Walt Abernethy filing a formal complaint with the county recorder and getting nothing back but silence. She thought about Cullen's barn burning 3 weeks after he tried to dispute a loan term through legitimate channels. She thought about the list she'd found in Silas's paperwork, a notation in a margin, Gideon Cross's handwriting, that she hadn't mentioned to anyone yet because she wasn't sure what it meant. It was her name, Abigail. Written 2 weeks before she'd arrived in Wyoming, next to Silas's name and loan account number. She'd found it 4 days ago. She'd been sitting with it since. I need to think about this, she said. Tom nodded as if he'd expected that. Ellen picked up her coffee. They stayed another hour, talking about the planting season, about the cattle market, about whether the creek on the north boundary was going to flood again this year the way it had in '81. Normal things. The kind of conversation that neighbors have. When they left, Abigail stood on the porch and watched their wagon go and then stood there a few minutes longer, alone. Silas found her there when he came in for the noon meal. Hallorans were here, she said. I saw the wagon tracks. He looked at her face. What happened? She told him. All of it, including the part about Cross's private office, including the part about the timing of his Cheyenne trip, including the part she'd been keeping to herself, the margin notation with her name on it. Silas went very still when she got to that last part. He knew you were coming, he said, before I arrived, which means he knew about the arrangement between my father and you before I even knew about it. She turned to look at him. I don't think that's a coincidence. Silas was working through this. She could see it. The particular internal process he had, the stillness that was actually rapid recalculation. He keeps track of every ranch in this valley. He would have known about the loan, about the arrangement. He noted my name specifically, she said. Not just the loan, my name. 2 weeks before I arrived. She paused. I think he was watching to see what would happen when someone new came to the Boone Quarter. Someone who might look at the books. Or he was planning something. Yes, that too. She looked back at the road the Halloran wagon had taken. If we go through legitimate channels, federal marshal, formal complaint, it takes time. Lawyers respond to lawyers. Cross has better lawyers. He has more time. He has more money. She stopped. But if there's documented proof in that house, master contracts, correspondence, the original scheme written in his own hand, then a federal investigation has something to investigate. Not just our testimony, not just our amended loan statements, actual evidence of intent. Abigail. His voice was careful. What you're describing is breaking into a man's private property. I know what it is. If we're caught, I know what happens if we're caught. He was quiet for a moment. You'd be the one caught, he said. I'm not letting you. You're not letting me? She turned to look at him directly. She said it without heat, but the directness of it was clear enough. He stopped. I'm sorry, he said. That's not... He rubbed the back of his neck. That came out wrong. Slightly. She softened it. I know what you mean, but Silas, I'm already in this. My name is in his notes. If he's watching this ranch, and I think he is, I think Danny was passing him information before he left. Then the decision about how far we're in was made without our input. She looked at him steadily. We go together or not at all? He looked at her for a long moment. In the weeks since she'd arrived, something had changed in the way he looked at her. She'd noticed it happening gradually, the way the light changes in late afternoon, slowly enough that you don't see it move but differently when you look up. He didn't look at her the way a man looks at an inconvenient arrangement anymore. She wasn't sure exactly how he looked at her now, but it was something else. All right, he said, together. They needed 4 things. a night when Cross was confirmed to be in Cheyenne, a way into the estate that didn't involve breaking a door down, a plan for what to look for and how to carry it, and someone to stay with the girls. Margaret Kane handled the last one without being asked. When Abigail rode out to tell her what they were planning, not asking permission, not asking for advice, just telling because Margaret deserved to know, the older woman listened and then said, "I'll come to yours. The girls can sleep at my place if it runs long." She said it the way she said most things, like a fact she'd assessed and accepted and had no patience for discussing further. Ellen Halloran's sister's husband sent word through a roundabout chain, neighbor to neighbor, nothing written. When Cross's carriage was confirmed departing Cheyenne, heading east toward Harlan Creek, he was, according to the confirmed report, traveling with his personal secretary and one guard. The estate would be staffed by 4 ranch hands on rotating patrol, none of whom were known to be particularly alert after 10 o'clock in the evening. Silas knew the layout of the estate's exterior because he'd made a delivery of cattle there 3 years ago, before the relationship had soured entirely, and had a rough sense of the east wing's position relative to the main entrance. The carpentry brother-in-law had provided, through Tom Halloran, a slightly more detailed picture of which windows were which, and where the East Wing office sat in relation to the garden on the back of the property. They went on a Thursday. Cross was confirmed in Cheyenne. The girls were with Margaret. Pete had been told, vaguely, that they had business, and he should handle the morning feeding without them. Pete had the particular quality of a man who understood when not to ask questions. They rode out at 9 in the evening and approached the estate from the west, leaving the horses tied in a dry creek bed about a quarter-mile from the property line. The night was clear, good for visibility, which cut both ways. Plenty of stars, no moon yet. The grass was wet from afternoon rain, which kept their footsteps quiet. The estate was bigger than Abigail had imagined. Not a ranch house made impressive by ambition, but a genuine structure. 2 stories, double chimneys. The kind of building that was meant to make a specific statement about its owner to anyone who approached it. The grounds were fenced, but not difficult. They went over at the back corner, where a mature cottonwood pressed close enough to the fence line to provide a step up. The east wing was dark. 2 of the 4 windows were shuttered. The other 2 had curtains drawn, but no light behind them. Getting in through a shuttered window took longer than Silas had estimated and made more noise than either of them found comfortable. Abigail stood watch while he worked at the shutter latch with a thin piece of wire, listening to the silence of the estate and the farther silence of the valley around it. Wind in the grass. Somewhere, cattle. The distant sound of a ranch hand moving around at the front of the property. Footsteps. A cough. The flare of a match. The shutter came open. They were inside in 60 seconds. The office was locked, a solid interior door with a key lock that was better quality than the window shutter. Silas looked at it for a moment in the dark, then looked at Abigail. She'd anticipated this. She'd been practicing with the same wire and a similar lock mechanism on a salvaged door she'd found in the Boone Quarters barn. It had taken her 3 nights to get it consistently. It took her 4 minutes in the dark, by feel, before the lock gave. They pushed the door open. The office was smaller than she'd expected and more organized. Gideon Cross was, whatever else he was, a systematic man. The desk was clear except for a writing set and an oil lamp. The shelves along the wall were labeled in a precise hand, county names, year ranges, individual family names. She ran her finger along them in the darkness, Silas holding the shutter open for what moonlight they had. Abernethy, Halloran, Prescott, Kane, and at the end of the row, Boone. She pulled the Boone file first and leafed through it with hands that were not entirely steady. The loan origination papers, originals signed by Silas, matched the documents he had at home. Rate schedule, amendment clause, all of it. But behind the standard paperwork, a separate set of documents in a different folder. A projected acquisition timeline. Target date for foreclosure. Notes in Cross's hand about the value of the property for cattle expansion once the existing ownership was removed. The target date was 8 months from now. She put the file back and pulled the others. Abernethy, Halloran, Prescott, Kane, all of them had the same structure, the standard loan paperwork up front, and behind it, in Cross's own handwriting, the acquisition plan. Projected foreclosure dates, notes about property values, land use, consolidation of grazing territory, notes about which family members might contest and which would fold. For the Abernethy file, there was a final notation dated after the foreclosure. Resolved. Under Crossland Company Management, effective October 1880. Net acquisition value exceeds initial projection by 14%. Resolved. The word used for a transaction, for a business problem that had been handled efficiently. Abigail stood in Gideon Cross's locked office in the dark and felt something cold move through her that was not quite rage and not quite grief, but lived in the neighborhood of both. Abigail, Silas's voice barely above a whisper. We need to move. She had brought a canvas satchel under her coat. She began selecting documents, not randomly, deliberately. The acquisition timelines for all 4 remaining ranches, the projected foreclosure notes, 2 letters that she found in a separate drawer bound with string, correspondence between Cross and a name she didn't recognize in the Cheyenne Land Registry office, discussing, in language careful enough to almost obscure its meaning, but not careful enough, how filings could be managed to ensure foreclosure proceedings moved without scrutiny. That last one she held for a moment longer than the others. Then she put it in the satchel. She took 18 documents in total, left everything else exactly as she'd found it, closed the folders, returned them to their places on the shelf, relocked the door from outside. That took longer, coming from the other direction, and her hands were shaking slightly by the time the mechanism clicked. Getting back out through the window was faster than getting in. Silas went first, then helped her through, and they had the shutter back in its resting position by the time the ranch hand at the front of the property coughed again, and his footsteps started moving in their direction. Routine patrol, not response, but close enough to be uncomfortable. They pressed flat against the outside wall of the east wing and waited. The footsteps came around the corner of the main house and went about halfway along the south side before stopping. A pause that lasted long enough for Abigail to become thoroughly aware of her own heartbeat and the sound of Silas breathing beside her, and the specific discomfort of pressing against cold stone with a canvas satchel of stolen documents under her coat. Then the footsteps retreated, back the way they'd come. They waited another 2 minutes without moving. Then they went back across the garden, over the fence at the cottonwood, through the wet grass to the dry creek bed where the horses were tied exactly where they'd left them, mercifully still and patient in the dark. They rode hard for the first mile, not talking. The night air was cold enough to matter at that pace, and Abigail bent low over the horse's neck and focused on the ground ahead of her and on keeping her grip on the reins steady. The satchel was against her body, the strap across her chest. When they pulled back to a walk, Silas came alongside her. "You all right?" he said. "Yes." Her voice came out slightly rougher than intended. "We got what we needed?" "More than we needed." She steadied her breathing. "He has an acquisition plan for every ranch in this valley, written in his own hand, projected foreclosure dates, property valuations, notes about each family." She paused. "He's been planning this for years, Silas, not reacting to the drought, not taking advantage of opportunities as they arose. Planned. From the beginning." He was quiet for a moment, riding beside her through the dark. "How long?" he said. "The oldest acquisition notes I saw were dated 1876, 4 years before the drought even hit." She looked at him. "I think the drought was a convenience. I don't think it was the cause." Another silence. The horses moved through the grass at a steady walk, and the stars were very bright, and the valley was enormous and dark around them. "There were letters," she said, "correspondence with someone in the Cheyenne Land Registry, about managing the filing process for foreclosures, about keeping them from being looked at too closely. He has someone in the registry office. It looks that way. I took the letters." She put her hand against the satchel. "Along with everything else." Silas was thinking. She could tell by the quality of his silence, the particular density of it, when he was working through something. "When we go to the federal marshal," he said carefully, "these documents—" "I know how we got them," she said. "I've thought about it." She had, in fact, spent considerable time thinking about it. Whether documents obtained by breaking into a private property would be admissible, whether they'd simply be the basis for their own criminal charges rather than Cross's, whether the whole thing was a catastrophic miscalculation. "They can't use what we took as direct evidence, in all likelihood, but what they can do is know where to look. A federal investigation with subpoena authority can get these same documents legally. We just need to put them in front of someone with the authority to look." "That's a thin line," he said. "Everything about this is a thin line." She said it without apology. Cross has lawyers and money and 12 years of practice at making things look legal. We have paper and pattern and 18 documents we took from a locked room. She paused. It's what we have, so it's what we're using. They reached the Boone Quarter just before 2 in the morning. The house was dark. The girls safely away at Margaret's. Pete was presumably asleep in the bunkhouse and asking no questions. Silas unsaddled the horses while Abigail went inside and laid the documents on the kitchen table in the lamplight. She went through them again, properly this time, with the ability to read without the pressure of the dark and the patrol footsteps and the counting seconds. Each one was what she'd thought it was. Each one was damning in a specific and different way. She was still at the table when Silas came in. He sat down across from her without speaking and began reading through the documents she'd finished with. At some point, she'd lost track of time, he looked up from a page and said he had Danny reporting to him for at least a year before Danny quit. I know, there's a note. It says, he stopped, read it again. It says Abigail, your name, has been reviewing loan documents and may present a complication. She'd seen it. She'd been sitting with it. The word complication, her, rendered as a problem to be managed, in the handwriting of a man she'd never met, in a notation made 2 weeks after she'd arrived at the Boone Quarter. That's what I am to him, she said. A complication. He's wrong about what kind, Silas said. He said it quietly, without ceremony. She looked at him across the documents and the lamplight, and the remains of the evening's terrible fear. He met her eyes and didn't look away. They left for Cheyenne 4 days later, early morning before the valley fully woke, with a leather satchel of documents and 2 days of hard riding ahead of them. Pete understood, without being told the full shape of it, that things were in motion. Margaret had the girls. Tom Halloran knew the direction they were going and why. The rest of the valley would find out soon enough. So would Gideon Cross. The road to Cheyenne was 2 days of hard country, grassland that rolled and dipped without apology, creek crossings that were deeper than they looked in spring runoff, stretches of open ground where the wind came at you sideways and didn't stop. They rode mostly in silence, not because there was nothing to say, but because the horses needed steady pacing and the terrain needed attention, and sometimes silence is its own form of communication between two people who have spent enough time together to stop filling every gap. They'd packed light. The leather satchel rode behind Abigail's saddle, wrapped in oilskin against the weather. She checked it at every stop without meaning to. A hand against the oilskin, confirming what she already knew was there. Silas noticed. He didn't say anything about it. The first night they made camp at a creek bend that had a decent stand of cottonwood for wind cover. Silas built the fire and Abigail made coffee, real coffee, properly made, because she had accepted that the 2 days of travel were hard enough without adding Silas's version of the drink to them. They ate cold biscuits and dried beef and sat close enough to the fire that the warmth was real. Tell me about Elias Grant, she said. Silas turned his cup in his hands. What Pete told me, and Pete's not a man who talks much, is that Grant came here from Missouri 8 years ago. Before that, he was a marshal in Kansas during the cattle drive years, which means he's seen things. A pause. Pete said he had a reputation for being thorough, not fast. Thorough. Thorough is what we need. Pete also said he doesn't take well to being managed. If he thinks someone's running him toward a conclusion, he pulls back. He looked at her across the fire. We put the documents in front of him and we let him draw his own conclusions. I wasn't planning to manage him, she said. I know. I'm saying it for my own benefit. I have a tendency when I'm nervous to over-explain things. She looked at him. He said it plainly, without embarrassment, in the way that people are sometimes unexpectedly honest about their own failings when they're tired and sitting by a fire. I'll tell you if you're doing it, she said. I'd appreciate that. She finished her coffee and rinsed the cups and lay down with her coat over her and looked up at the stars through the cottonwood branches. The satchel was 2 feet from her head. She was aware of it the way you're aware of something important in the dark. Not anxious exactly, just present to it. She'd been thinking about the letters. The correspondence between Cross and the man in the Cheyenne Land Registry. She hadn't named him to Silas yet because she wanted to be in front of Grant when that name came out. Wanted to see the marshal's reaction to it, wanted to understand whether that particular piece of information was going to complicate their reception or clarify it. A man with a contact inside the territory's land registry wasn't just manipulating loan terms. He was operating inside the legal infrastructure itself. That was a different order of problem, and it would tell her something about Grant, whether he flinched from it or leaned in, that she needed to know. She fell asleep with the fire burning low and the creek running steadily nearby, and Silas still sitting up, which she noticed but didn't mention. They were riding before sunrise. By the time they reached the outskirts of Cheyenne on the second afternoon, Abigail's back was complaining specifically and at length, and the horses were tired in the particular way that suggests they have opinions about the situation and would like them acknowledged. The city was relative. Compared to Harrisburg, it was a large town, but in Wyoming territory it was substantial enough to feel like a different world from the Harlan Creek Valley, spread out ahead of them in the afternoon light, more organized and more commercial than she'd expected. She found herself straightening in the saddle without deciding to. An old habit. Her mother had told her, when she was small, that the way you enter a room tells people things before you open your mouth. She'd never entirely stopped believing it. The federal marshal's office was on a side street off the main commercial thoroughfare. A 2-story building with a federal seal on the door and a flag that snapped in the wind. 2 horses were tied out front. A deputy was sitting on the step with a coffee cup and the expression of a young man working very hard at looking alert. He was perhaps 22. "We need to see Marshal Grant," Silas said. "Marshall's busy." The deputy didn't look up from his coffee. "We've ridden 2 days from Harlan Creek," Abigail said. The deputy looked up. "We have documented evidence of a fraud scheme operating across at least 4 properties in the valley, and likely more. We'd like to see the marshal, please." The deputy looked at her, then at Silas, then back at her. "Wait here," he said, and went inside with considerably more speed than his initial presentation had suggested he possessed. They waited 7 minutes. Abigail knew because she counted. Then the door opened and the deputy gestured them in. Elias Grant was not what she'd assembled from Pete's description. She'd built a picture of someone large and deliberate, the way marshals tended to look in her imagination. Grant was medium height, lean, with a face that had been weathered past the point where you could accurately guess his age. Somewhere between 45 and 60, impossible to narrow further. He had pale gray eyes that moved to the satchel before they moved to her face, which told her something. "Mr. and Mrs. Boone," he said. "Mercer Boone," she said. "Abigail Mercer. Silas Boone is my husband." Slight pause. "Mrs. Mercer. Mr. Boone, sit down." He gestured at 2 chairs across from a desk that was covered in organized papers, very organized, which she noted. "Deputy Reeves says you've got documents." "We do." She set the satchel on the desk. "Didn't open it yet. Before I show you anything, I want to tell you what you're looking at and where it came from. Because part of where it came from is complicated, and you should know that going in." Grant looked at her. The gray eyes were attentive in the specific way of a man who has learned to listen for what people don't say. "Go ahead." She told him. She laid out the whole shape of it, the way she'd assembled it over weeks. The loan documents, the rate manipulation, the amendment clause sealing, the pattern across 4 ranches, the timing of the rate adjustments, the Abernethy foreclosure, the complaint that had gone nowhere with the county recorder. She told it plainly, in order, without drama. When she got to the estate, she paused. "The private documents," she said, "the acquisition timelines and the correspondence, I need to tell you how we obtained them." Grant hadn't moved. "Tell me." She told him that too. All of it. The estate, the window, the locked office, the specific documents taken. She kept her eyes on his face while she said it. She wasn't going to look away from it. When she finished, the office was quiet. Grant looked at the satchel, then at her, then at Silas. "You broke into a private residence," he said. "Yes." "And removed documents." "Yes." "That's a crime, Mrs. Mercer." "I'm aware of that." She kept her voice level. "What Cross has been doing to 4 ranch families for over a decade is also a crime. A larger one, I'd argue, though I recognize that's not how the law formally weighs those things." Grant was quiet for a moment. His expression was not readable in any simple direction. "Show me the documents," he said. She opened the satchel. She laid them out methodically. The loan originals with the rate manipulations marked, the chart she'd made of the pattern, and then the estate documents, the acquisition timelines in Cross's handwriting, the projected foreclosure notes, the family-by-family assessments. Last, she put the 2 letters from the Cheyenne Land Registry correspondence in front of him. He picked up the letters first. She'd expected that. The name on them, the registry contact, was a man named Howell. She watched Grant's face when he read it. Something moved behind the gray eyes. Not surprise exactly. The slight internal shift of a man whose suspicion about something has just been confirmed. "You know who Howell is," she said. "I know who Howell is." He set the letter down. "He's been at the registry office for 6 years. There have been questions about certain filings for almost that long." He said it carefully. The carefully of a man who has been building his own picture and has just been handed a piece he'd been missing. "The letters are dated across 4 years," she said. "They discuss, in careful language, how to manage the foreclosure filing process for the Abernethy property, and at least 2 others I couldn't identify by the property references alone. Cross pays Howell for, they call it administrative assistance." She paused. "I think administrative assistance means making sure that foreclosure filings against struggling ranchers don't receive the review that might reveal the fraud in the underlying loan terms." Grant looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "How long were you looking at the documents in the office?" 45 minutes, approximately. I read quickly. He picked up the acquisition timeline for the Boone quarter, turned to the page she'd turned to in the dark, with her hands not entirely steady. The projected foreclosure date. The property valuation in Cross's handwriting. The note at the bottom about Abigail herself. New wife reviewing documents. Complication anticipated. "He knew about you," Grant said. "His informant on the ranch told him I was looking at the loan paperwork." "Yes." "And he noted you as a complication." "Which I intend to be," she said. Grant set the document down. He leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment in the manner of a man running through a series of calculations that live in a different part of the brain than ordinary thinking. "The documents from the estate," he said finally. "I can't use them as direct evidence. You understand that?" "I understand that. I also understand that a federal investigation with subpoena authority can obtain these same documents legally, now that you know exactly where they are and what they contain." He looked at her. Something in the gray eyes that wasn't quite a smile, but was in the same general county. "You've thought this through." "I've had 2 days on horseback to think about very little else." He stood up and went to the window, looked out at the street for a moment. When he turned back, something had settled in his posture. The particular settling of a man who has made a decision and is now operating from within it rather than approaching it. "I've had reports from this valley before," he said. "Nothing formal, nothing actionable. 2 years ago I got a letter, unsigned, which meant I couldn't do much with it, that said Cross was manipulating loan terms across multiple properties. I had no documentation, no witness willing to be named, no way to pursue it." He looked at the documents on the desk. "This is documentation." "Yes," she said. "The witnesses, the other ranchers, would they testify formally to a federal inquiry?" She thought about Tom Halloran holding very still. About Luke Prescott, 21 years old, who'd said, "So do we," with half his voice and all of his stubbornness. About Margaret Kane, jaw set, 5 years of overpayment converting itself into something harder. If they believed it would actually go somewhere, she said. "Yes. Then here's what I'm going to do." Grant came back to the desk. "I'm going to open a formal inquiry into the Crossland Company's lending practices in the Harlan Creek Valley. I'm going to issue subpoenas for the original loan documents, all of them, not just the ones you brought me. I'm going to subpoena the registry filings related to the Abernethy foreclosure and any others that went through Howell's office in the relevant period." He paused. "And I'm going to have a conversation with Howell tomorrow morning that he's not going to enjoy." Abigail felt something release in her chest. Not relief exactly. She was experienced enough with how these things went to understand that opening an inquiry was not the same as winning one. But the shape of it, the formal machinery of it beginning to move, was something. "The estate documents," she said. "The originals are still there. If Cross returns and realizes they've been looked at, how carefully did you replace them?" "Exactly. I'm certain of it." She paused. "The window shutter is the weak point. It was already slightly damaged at the latch. He may or may not notice." "I'll move quickly," Grant said. "But Mrs. Mercer," he said it with a weight that made her hold still. "Cross will find out about this inquiry, probably within the week.
That's not something I can prevent. A man with his resources has ears in places they shouldn't be. I know.
You should go back to your valley and be careful. He said it without making it dramatic. Just a fact, delivered with the flat authority of a man who understood exactly what Gideon Cross would do when he felt the ground shifting under him. The ride back felt different from the ride out. Heavier in some ways and lighter in others. The weight of what they'd done settling in, the lightness of having done it. They didn't push the horses as hard on the return. The urgency of the outward journey had been replaced by something more complicated. The second night on the road, Silas said, out of nowhere, with the fire between them, "My father would not have done what we just did." She looked at him. "Gone to the marshal?" "Broken into the estate," he said it looking at the fire. He was a careful man. He believed in doing things the right way, even when the right way was losing. Is that a criticism? No? He poked at the fire. I'm saying, I don't know what I'm saying, that things change, I suppose. What counts as the right way changes depending on what the wrong way has already done. She was quiet a moment. Are you worried about what Grant's going to do with the information about the estate?
Some, yes. So am I. She said it honestly. But less than I'm worried about what happens if Cross forecloses on Luke Prescott in 8 months and then comes for us. Silas looked at her across the fire. He had a date in that file. 8 months from now. It was the closest one, she paused. He was coming for the Boone Quarter regardless of what we did. We just made ourselves a problem he has to deal with before he can finish what he started. A long silence.
My father's generation would have lost this valley, Silas said. Not bitterly, just stating it. Maybe. Or maybe someone would have found the pattern eventually. Eventually might have been too late. She didn't disagree. They reached Harlan Creek on the 4th afternoon. Sore, trail dusty, the horses with legitimate grievances. Abigail went straight to Margaret Kane's before going home, because the girls had been there 5 days, and she needed to see them before she needed anything else. Clara met her at the door. She had, in those 5 days, apparently reorganized Margaret's kitchen into a system that Margaret had declared both unnecessary and genuinely more logical. Ruth had befriended a barn cat and was in active negotiation with Margaret about whether she could take it home. Mama, Clara said, standing in Margaret's doorway with her arms folded in a way that she had clearly learned from Margaret over the past 5 days. You were gone a long time. I know, sweetheart. Margaret said you were handling important business. We were. Did it work? Abigail looked at her daughter, 9 years old, her father's gray-green eyes, a mind that would not stop running, and she said, We started something. Whether it works depends on what other people do with it. Clara considered this with the gravity she applied to most things. That seems unsatisfying, she said. It is, Abigail agreed, but it's how most important things actually function. Margaret appeared behind Clara in the doorway. She looked at Abigail with the assessment she applied to everything. Quick, thorough, landing on what mattered. Grant? He opened an inquiry, Abigail said. He's moving on Howell. Margaret was quiet for a moment. Something moved across her face. Not relief, not vindication, something more weathered than either of those things. The look of a woman who has been waiting for a long time for something to start and is not yet entirely sure she believes it has. Come inside, she said. Both of you. There's food. The valley found out in pieces, which was the only way a small community learned things, through the sideways movement of information from one person to the next, altered slightly in each transmission, arriving at the far edges of the community somewhat distorted but roughly intact in its essential shape. Word went through first that Silas Boone and his wife had ridden to Cheyenne, then that they'd met with the federal marshal, then, and this one moved faster, that there was a federal inquiry into the Crossland Company's operations in the valley. Mabel Cook, who ran the general store and whose information network was the closest thing Harlan Creek had to a newspaper, told 2 women about it on a Monday. By Wednesday, it had reached every ranch within 20 miles. By Friday, Abigail had received 4 separate visitors at the Boone Quarter from ranchers she'd never met, coming from the north end of the valley. Families she hadn't known were involved. People she'd never had in her chart because she hadn't known to look for them. They came quietly. Some of them came alone, some with their wives. They sat at her kitchen table with the particular dignity of people who have been ashamed of their circumstances for a long time. and are in the process of discovering that the circumstances were not, in fact, their fault. They brought their papers. She went through every one, made notes, added names to the chart, which by this point had outgrown the single sheet of paper it had started on, and now covered 3 sheets pinned together and spread across the study floor. The pattern held. Every time, the same clause. Every time, the same timing. Every time, a rate that exceeded what the contract ceiling allowed, extracted from people who were too isolated and too frightened and too busy surviving to catch it. 8 ranches. That was the count when she finished, not 4. 8 families who had been paying above their contractual ceiling, some of them for years. Grant's deputy appeared in Harlan Creek on a Thursday. A different deputy from the young man on the step, this one older and more purposeful, with a stack of subpoenas and a list of questions that indicated Grant was moving faster than Abigail had dared to expect. He subpoenaed the original loan documents from each ranch. He went to the county recorder's office and subpoenaed the Abernethy foreclosure filing. He asked, with careful federal politeness, to speak with every rancher who had a Cross loan currently outstanding. He did not go to Gideon Cross. Not yet. Cross's response to the inquiry came sideways, the way all of Cross's moves came. Not directly, but through the channels he controlled. A lawyer's letter arrived at the Boone Quarter 10 days after they returned from Cheyenne. It was addressed to Silas and used very precise language to suggest that the loan on the Boone Quarter property was in technical default due to a payment irregularity from 8 months ago, an irregularity that Abigail had no memory of and, when she checked the payment records, found no evidence of. It was manufactured. She was certain of it. A fabricated default notice designed to create legal pressure, to give Cross the leverage to call the loan before the investigation could get its footing. She took the letter to Grant's deputy the following morning. He looked at it for a long moment. Then he looked at her. "He knows," he said. Yes, she'd expected this. Grant had warned her. "He's trying to move before the inquiry can. We'll need to document the payment record." "I have every receipt," she said. She put the receipt file on the desk. "I keep every paper." She said it with a slight inflection that suggested she might have learned this from someone, and the deputy, who had by now heard enough about Margaret Kane to understand the reference, almost smiled. The fabricated default was the first move. It wasn't the last. Over the following 3 weeks, Cross's lawyers filed motions in the territorial court challenging the legitimacy of the federal inquiry itself, arguing jurisdiction, arguing procedure, arguing the standing of the parties involved with the specific creativity of very expensive legal minds doing what expensive legal minds do when their client is cornered. The Valley watched. And here was the thing that Abigail had not quite anticipated, had hoped for, had told herself was possible, but had not entirely believed until she saw it. The Valley stopped being quiet. Tom Halloran gave a sworn statement to Grant's office, so detailed and so carefully documented that the deputy told Abigail it was the clearest testimony he'd taken in 6 years of work. Margaret Kane brought her wooden box to the deputy's temporary office in Harlan Creek and sat across from him for 4 hours and answered every question he asked with the precision of a woman who had been keeping records specifically against this day. Luke Prescott, 21 years old, managing his dead father's ranch alone, skittish as a colt in traffic, stood up in front of Grant's deputy and told everything he knew, including things he'd been afraid to say out loud for 2 years. The other 4 ranches, the ones Abigail hadn't found until the Valley started talking, added their testimony, their papers, their payment receipts, their stories. Each voice was different. Each one had the specific texture of a life that had been shaped by 12 years of Cross's quiet pressure. The decisions not made, the expansions not attempted, the children who'd left for somewhere better because the ranch couldn't support them, the debt that had sat like a stone on every morning for years. Each one was angry in a different way. Together, they were something Cross had not accounted for, a complete picture. Grant came to Harlan Creek himself in early June. He was there for 2 days and he moved through the valley quietly and methodically, meeting people, reading documents, walking property lines, asking the specific questions of a man who has built most of a structure and is checking the foundation before putting the last piece in. He came to the Boone Quarter on the second day, sat at the kitchen table. Clara had made coffee, demonstrating in the process that she had learned correctly from Abigail and not from Silas, and went through the full chart with Abigail for 2 hours. When he finished, he sat back and looked at the chart the way people look at something they've been trying to see clearly for a long time. 8 ranches, he said, 12 years. The same mechanism, executed consistently enough that I can demonstrate it's a designed system rather than individual lending decisions. He paused. Plus the Howell correspondence, which I have now obtained legally through subpoena. What did Howell say? She asked. He said a great deal, Grant said. Initially he said nothing at all, and then his lawyer spoke with him privately, and then he said considerably more. He looked at her. Cross's arrangement with Howell goes back further than the letters you saw. 11 years. It's been his mechanism for ensuring that any legal challenge to a foreclosure proceeding gets managed at the filing stage before it can be seen by anyone with authority to act on it. That's why Walt Abernethy's complaint disappeared, Abigail said. Yes, filed, received, and quietly buried. Grant looked at the chart. This is systematic fraud at a scale that I can take to a federal prosecutor, the kind that doesn't depend on any single piece of evidence because the pattern itself is the evidence. He paused. Including the documents from the estate, which I obtained legally under subpoena 3 weeks ago. They were exactly where you said they were. She absorbed that. Cross is aware of the inquiry, Grant said. His lawyers have told him it's serious. I expect he'll make further moves to protect himself. But his leverage in this valley, he stopped, seemed to choose his words, has weakened considerably now that people are talking. His primary tool was isolation. Each family thinking they were alone in this, that fighting back would mark them as troublemakers with no one standing beside them. He looked at her directly. You broke the isolation. She thought about the kitchen table, the stream of visitors with their papers, Tom Halloran's careful, detailed statement, Margaret Kane's 4 hours of precise testimony, Luke Prescott standing up in front of a deputy and saying what he knew. They broke it themselves, she said. I just showed them what the picture looked like when you put all the pieces together. Grant gathered his papers and stood. At the door he paused. Mrs. Mercer, the inquiry will run its course. These things are rarely fast. Cross will fight, his lawyers will find delays, the territorial court will weigh in on the jurisdiction questions his side raised. He said it honestly, without softening. I can't promise you a timeline. But you can promise the inquiry continues. As long as I have breath and a federal badge, yes. He looked at her. I don't take cases I'm not going to finish. She believed him, not because she was inclined to be trusting. She wasn't. She'd learned better. But because of what she'd seen in his face when he read the Howell correspondence. The particular expression of a man who has been patient for a long time and has finally, carefully, gotten hold of the thing he was patient for. After he left, she stood on the porch for a while. The June evening was warm, the first genuinely warm evening of the year, the kind that in Wyoming feels like an argument one rather than a seasonal inevitability. The fields around the ranch house had been worked, she and Silas and Pete, through April and most of May, and there was green coming up in the south field where there'd been nothing but dry grass since before she arrived. Silas came out and stood beside her. Well, he said. It's moving, she said. Grant's serious. He has what he needs. She paused. Cross is going to fight. I know. It could be months, longer. I know that too. She looked out at the south field. The wheat's coming up. I noticed a silence between them that had a different quality than the silences of those first weeks. Not awkward, not careful, just two people standing in the same place at the same time, looking at the same thing. He called it a complication, she said. In his notes, us coming to Cheyenne, the inquiry, all of it. How would you call it? Silas said. She thought about that for a moment. About the train from Harrisburg, the carpet bag and the 2 daughters and the $30 in the savings envelope, and her father standing at the door saying he'd made arrangements. About the loan papers spread across the kitchen table at 2 a.m, and the pattern she'd found. And the wooden box in Margaret Kane's kitchen, and the window shutter on the east wing of Gideon Cross's estate in the dark. About the 8 families sitting at her kitchen table, one by one, with their papers. Inevitable, she said. Sooner or later someone was going to look carefully enough. Silas considered this beside her. Good thing it was you, he said. He said it simply, without drama, looking at the south field. She didn't answer that, But she didn't move away from where she was standing either, and after a moment Silas's shoulder was close enough to hers that she could feel the warmth of it through her coat, and neither of them said anything about that at all. Grant had said it wouldn't be fast. He was right. The months that followed were not the clean resolution that people imagine when they think about justice. The kind where the guilty man is marched away in handcuffs on a Tuesday afternoon, and everything damaged is restored by Wednesday. It was slower than that, messier than that, and there were stretches of it that felt less like progress and more like standing in the same difficult place while the ground shifted underneath you in ways you couldn't quite see or measure. Cross's lawyers were good. They filed motions in territorial court challenging federal jurisdiction, and those motions had to be answered, and answering them took time. They filed a counter-complaint against Silas for the fabricated loan default, which had to be formally disputed with documentation, which Abigail handled with the same methodical attention she'd applied to everything else. Receipt by receipt, payment by payment, building a record so complete that when Cross's lawyer finally saw the full file, he went quiet in a way that his client clearly did not appreciate. Cross himself never appeared in Harlan Creek during those months. He communicated through intermediaries and legal correspondence, which told Abigail something about him that she filed away. A man who operates through systems and distance, who built his empire on paper and proxies, does not do well when the paper turns against him. He didn't know how to fight something he could see and touch. He only knew how to manage things from behind a wall of documentation. She understood that more than she expected to. There was a hearing in Cheyenne in October, Federal Territorial Court, a long room with high windows and a judge who looked permanently exhausted by the weight of everything people brought to him. Abigail and Silas were there. Margaret Kane was there, in her best coat, with her wooden box now reconstructed into a formally organized evidence file that Grant's office had helped her prepare. Tom and Ellen Halloran sat 3 rows back. Luke Prescott sat beside them, jaw set, still the same combination of frightened and stubborn that he'd had the morning Silas came to his gate. Cross arrived with 2 lawyers and a personal secretary, and the particular posture of a man who has spent years being the largest presence in every room he enters and has not yet accepted that this room might be different. He looked at Abigail once directly when he came in. She looked back at him without moving. He was older than she'd imagined, mid-60s, heavy-set, with a face that had been handsome at some point and had since settled into something harder and more defended. The look he gave her lasted about 3 seconds and contained, she thought, a genuine assessment. The first time he'd actually looked at the complication rather than just noting its existence. Then he looked away and sat down with his lawyers and began speaking to them in a low voice. The hearing lasted 2 days. Grant presented the inquiry findings, methodically, precisely, with the thoroughness that Pete had described and that Abigail had come to rely on. The pattern of rate manipulation across 8 properties, the Howell correspondence, the acquisition timelines found in the estate during the legally executed subpoena search. The testimony of ranchers who had each individually told the same story in enough specific detail that the overlap was impossible to explain as coincidence or misremembering. Cross's lawyers argued. They were skilled at arguing. They found procedural gaps and exploited them, found ambiguous language and stretched it, found technical objections to individual pieces of evidence and raised them with the confidence of people who are paid to manufacture doubt. The judge listened to all of it with his permanently exhausted expression and wrote things down and sent everyone home after the second day without rendering a decision. The decision came in December. 6 weeks of waiting, which was its own particular experience. Getting up every morning and doing the work of the ranch, feeding cattle and repairing fence line and managing the accounts. All of it carrying underneath it the low, continuous hum of an outcome that hadn't arrived yet. Clara handled the waiting with characteristic practicality, having decided that worrying about things she couldn't affect was an inefficient use of mental resources. Ruth handled it by befriending every animal within reach of the property, including Margaret Kane's barn cat, which had in fact come to live at the Boone Quarter and had opinions about everyone. Silas handled it badly, not in a dramatic way, but in the way of a man who is not built for uncertainty and has very little experience managing it without letting it leak into his face. Abigail handled it by working. There was always enough work. Grant's letter arrived on a Thursday in the first week of December. Silas brought it in from the road where the postwriter had left it and set it on the kitchen table without opening it, which told her everything about his relationship with uncertainty. She opened it. She read it standing at the table. Then she sat down. Abigail, Silas said. She looked up. The ruling supports the federal inquiry's findings, she said. The rate manipulation is ruled fraudulent under territorial lending law. The Howell arrangement constitutes conspiracy to obstruct legal process. She set the letter down. Cross is facing federal charges, fraud, conspiracy, and there's a third count related to the fabricated default notice he sent us. That one's specific to us. Silas was very still. The territorial court is ordering a full review of all foreclosure proceedings facilitated through Howell's office in the past 12 years, she continued, including the Abernethy foreclosure. She heard his breath change. The debts, she said, the overpayments, the interest charged above the contractual ceiling are being reviewed for restitution. The letter says the calculations are ongoing, but the principle has been established. She paused. The Boone Quarter loan is suspended pending review. A silence in the kitchen that had weight and texture. Suspended, Silas said. No payments required during the review period, and if the overpayment calculation holds, she'd done the rough math weeks ago, had done it, and then set it aside because doing the math wasn't the same as winning the case, and she'd learned not to spend what she hadn't received. We've likely overpaid by more than the outstanding principal. Silas sat down in the chair across from her. He put both hands flat on the table. He looked at them. It's not over, she said, because she needed to say it, needed him to hear it from her before hope ran too far ahead of reality. He'll appeal. His lawyers will find angles. The restitution review takes time. Walt Abernethy's situation is complicated because the land has been in Cross's management for 3 years now. None of this resolves cleanly or quickly. But it's moving, Silas said. He said it the way she'd said the same words to him in the summer. Not a question, a statement of something real, small, but load-bearing. It's moving, she confirmed. The arrest came in February, which was a hard month in Wyoming. Cold that had teeth, snow that came sideways off the mountains, the kind of weather that kept people inside and made everything feel slightly suspended. Cross was arrested in Cheyenne by federal agents, quietly, early on a Tuesday morning. There was no scene, no drama visible to anyone in Harlan Creek. They found out through Grant's deputy, who rode out to inform Silas personally, which was a courtesy that Abigail appreciated more than she expected to. The charges were read. The arraignment happened. Cross's lawyers entered a not guilty plea and requested bail, which was granted, a significant bail, but granted. He was not going to spend the months of legal proceedings in a cell. That was how it worked for men with his resources. Margaret Kane, when she heard the news, sat at her kitchen table for a long moment without speaking. Then she said, I want to write to the Abernethys. Write to them, Abigail said. Walt should know. He filed that complaint and it disappeared. He should know it didn't disappear entirely, just took longer. Write to them tonight, Abigail said. I'll give you their Colorado address. I found it in the inquiry files. Margaret looked at her. How do you have their Colorado address? I asked Grant's deputy for it 3 months ago. I thought someone might want it eventually. Margaret was quiet for a moment. Then she shook her head, not in disapproval, but in the way of a woman who has gotten used to being mildly astonished by the person across from her. You think 15 steps ahead, she said. Only 12, Abigail said. Sometimes I miss things. The trial itself was not until the following spring, 18 months in total, from the morning she had laid the loan papers in front of Grant in his Cheyenne office to the day a federal jury returned a verdict. 18 months was a long time, and a lot happened in it. The Boone Quarter planted and harvested. The overpayment restitution came through. Not the full amount she'd calculated, because the legal process had its own arithmetic, but enough. Enough to replace the aging cattle with better stock. Enough to fix the roof properly. Not just the northeast corner bucket, but the whole structure, replaced board by board through a September that was dry and cooperative for once. Enough to put money aside in a savings account that didn't immediately feel like it was draining. Hector retired in the fall. He was 71 and had been claiming he was 68 for years, and his knees had finally stopped accepting the claim. He went to live with his daughter in Colorado, and there was a dinner at the Boone Quarter the night before he left that was crowded and loud and involved more food than the table was structurally designed to support. And Ruth cried when he drove away in the morning,
which made Hector's eyes do something that was probably also crying, but that he would have disputed firmly if anyone mentioned it. They hired 2 new hands in the spring, younger men, one of whom was the younger brother of Luke Prescott, which Luke had suggested and which worked out better than Abigail had predicted, since the younger Prescott turned out to be both competent and significantly less skittish than his brother. Pete stayed. Pete would stay until the land stopped needing tending, and possibly after. Clara turned 11 and started riding with Silas on the property inspections, which had been her campaign for the better part of a year and which Silas had resisted and then gradually stopped resisting, in the way that most things Clara wanted eventually came to pass through the sheer force of her patient, relentless reasonableness. She had her mother's mind, and she was developing, slowly, her own relationship with the ranch. Not her mother's analytical engagement with the documents and the problems, but something more physical and specific, the way she could look at a fence line and see immediately where the tension was wrong. Ruth named everything. The barn cat had been named Corporal, which nobody had questioned after the first week because it suited him. The 2 new horses Silas bought in April were named Ferdinand and December, and when Silas observed that December was not a name for a horse, Ruth told him that the horse had been born in December and deserved to remember it, and Silas did not find a satisfactory counter-argument. The trial verdict came on a Friday afternoon in late April. Fraud, guilty. Conspiracy to obstruct legal process, guilty. The third count, the fabricated default, guilty. The sentencing was 3 weeks later. Gideon Cross received 8 years in a federal penitentiary and a financial judgment that would require the dissolution of the Crossland Company and the review of every property acquisition the company had made in the past 12 years. The Abernethy land was part of that review. Walt Abernethy, who had spent 3 years in Colorado and had, as they found out from Margaret's correspondence, been working in a lumber operation and had not been doing well, came back to Wyoming in the summer with his wife and 2 of his 3 children. The legal process for returning the property was complicated and slow and involved a great deal of paperwork that Abigail helped him navigate in the same kitchen where she'd navigated her own. The third child, a daughter, had married in Colorado and stayed. You could not give people back the years. That was the thing that sat with Abigail as she worked through the Abernethy restitution files. The years Walt and his family had spent in Colorado. The daughter who had built a different life and wasn't coming back. The things that had grown differently or not at all because of the years of pressure and loss. The money and the land could be reviewed and returned. The time was gone, and the accounting for it was imperfect, and the law didn't have a line item for it. She said as much to Silas one evening, and he listened and was quiet for a moment, and then said, "Walt knew that coming in. He said it to me when he arrived. He said he wasn't coming back for what he'd lost. He was coming back for what he could build from here." "That's a reasonable way to think about it," she said. "He's a reasonable man," Silas said. "Better at it than I am. You're improving," she said, and he looked at her sideways with the expression that was by now fully a smile, had been a complete actual smile for months, which had turned out to suit his face considerably better than the arrangement of defeat she'd found there when she'd stepped off the train. It had happened without either of them deciding it, the way most true things happen. Not a moment, but an accumulation of moments, each one small enough to miss, but collectively forming something that, when you looked up and assessed it clearly, was unmistakable. She could not have named the day it changed. She could tell you it had changed. She could tell you that the house felt different now than it had in those first weeks, that the silences had a different quality, that she knew the sound of his footsteps on the stairs the way she knew the sound of her daughter's breathing at night, automatically, without having to think about it, filed in the part of the mind that keeps track of what matters. One evening in June, a year after Grant had visited the ranch, a year almost exactly since the wheat in the south field had started coming up green, Silas found her on the porch. She'd been sitting there for a while, watching the light change across the fields. The south field was planted again, doing better this year than last. The north field, which they'd left fallow the first year, was also in now, winter wheat that would come up in fall. He sat down on the step beside her, not next to her exactly, but close. The evening was warm, and the sky was the particular shade of late June Wyoming that had no equivalent elsewhere, deep blue going to purple at the edges, clouds sitting still on the horizon like they had nowhere better to be. "I've been thinking," he said. "About what?" He was quiet for a moment, turning his hat over in his hands the way he did when he was working towards something. "When you came here," he said slowly, "I told you what you were walking into. The debt. The struggling ranch. I told you because I thought you should know, but I also—" He stopped. "I also thought I was telling you so you couldn't say you hadn't been warned." She looked at him. "Warned about what?" "That it wasn't going to work out. The ranch. The debt." A pause. "Me." He said it with the flat honesty of a man who has spent a long time being honest with himself about his own failings and has found it uncomfortable but preferable to the alternative. "I thought I was doing you a courtesy by telling you what bad shape everything was in. But I think what I was actually doing was giving you a reason to expect the worst." She was quiet. "I've thought about why I did that," he said. "I think it's because expecting the worst was what I'd been doing for about 3 years at that point. It felt like honesty. But it wasn't exactly honesty. It was—" He searched for the word. "It was preparation for a failure I'd already decided was coming." The evening light moved across the south field. A hawk turned in a slow circle over the far fence line. "You were wrong about the failure," she said. "I was wrong about most of it." He looked at her directly, which he did now without the careful distance of those early weeks. "I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer honestly." "I usually do." Is this—" He stopped again. For a man who had gotten considerably better at saying things in the year she'd known him, he still had a specific difficulty with the most important ones. She'd decided this was human rather than a defect. "Are you glad you stayed?" She looked at him. The question was naked and genuine and slightly afraid, and she understood it. Understood that he was asking not just about the ranch or the outcome of the case or the practical circumstances, but about the whole of it. The sum of the choice she'd made, or that had been made for her and that she'd made her own by degrees. She thought about Harrisburg, about the rented house and the $30 in the savings envelope, and her father standing at the door with his casual certainty that he'd solved a problem. She thought about the train, and Clara at the window, and Ruth's shoe falling off. She thought about the kitchen table, and the loan papers, and the lamp burning low. She thought about the wooden box, and the estate in the dark, and Grant's gray eyes moving to the satchel before they moved to her face. She thought about 8 families sitting in her kitchen, one by one, with their papers. "Yes," she said, simply, without ceremony, because the simple answer was the true one. "I'm glad I stayed." He looked at her a moment longer. Then he nodded, once, the way he received things he'd needed to hear, but hadn't known how to ask for directly. They sat on the porch for a while after that, watching the light leave the south field and the stars come up one by one the way they did out here, with a completeness and a density that still sometimes stopped her. The sheer number of them, the darkness out beyond the fence line that had nothing in it but land and sky and whatever was alive out there in the grass. Claire's voice came from inside, something to Ruth too muffled through the walls to make out the words, followed by Ruth's response, and then a sound that was probably the barn cat displacing himself from a chair. Normal sounds. The sounds of a household in motion. The valley would remember Gideon Cross the way valleys remember the things that damaged them. Not constantly, not obsessively, but with the particular long memory of communities that have been through something and carry the knowledge of it in their collective body. The story would get simplified with time, as stories do. The details would blur. The 12 years of careful, systematic pressure would compress into something more manageable for the telling. What wouldn't compress, what had a different kind of durability, was what had happened after. 8 families who had stopped being isolated from each other. A pattern of cooperation that had started in crisis and turned out to be useful in ordinary times. The habit of comparing notes, of watching for things in each other's operations that a single pair of eyes might miss. Small things, mostly. The kind of small things that accumulate. Walt Abernethy, rebuilding on his returned land that summer, had trouble with a water line that Pete knew how to fix. Luke Prescott, trying to expand his herd, got advice on pricing from Tom Halloran, who'd been doing it longer. Margaret Kane, who had always managed her ranch alone and taken a certain pride in it, started showing up to things. Not because she'd suddenly become a social creature, but because she had, somewhere in the past 2 years, developed opinions about the people around her and found that having opinions about people was easier when you saw them occasionally. She and Abigail had coffee on Thursdays, most weeks.
Margaret brought her box, a different one now, the original having been replaced after the evidence process, but the same system. And they went through whatever needed going through. Sometimes it was ranch business. Sometimes it was other things entirely. Margaret had a dry, precise sense of humor that she deployed rarely and with accuracy, and Abigail had learned to watch for it the way you watch for something that is easy to miss and worth catching. It was Margaret who said one Thursday in July, almost a year to the day after the verdict, "You know what Cross never understood about this valley." "Tell me," Abigail said. "He thought the families in it were resources, things to be managed and extracted from." Margaret set down her coffee. "He never thought about what they might do if they started talking to each other." Abigail was quiet for a moment. "He thought isolation was a strategy," she said. "He never considered that the opposite of isolation was also a strategy." "He was a man who was very good at one thing," Margaret said. "When that one thing stopped working, he had nothing else." Abigail looked out Margaret's kitchen window at the summer morning outside, the grass, the sky, the particular clear light of Wyoming in July that made everything look sharper than it usually did. She'd arrived in this valley with nothing but a carpet bag and 2 daughters and the remnants of a grief she was still working through and a future she hadn't chosen. She'd been described, in a locked office by a man who'd never met her, as a complication, something to be noted and managed and eventually removed from the equation. The thing about being underestimated by a systematic man was that systematic men tended to underestimate in systematic ways. They looked at what you had. They did not look at what you were willing to do with it. She'd had paper. She'd had a pattern. She'd had the stubbornness of someone who had decided, somewhere between Harrisburg and Harlan Creek, that disappearing was not available to her as an option. It had been enough. Not by itself. Never by itself. But in combination with 8 families who'd had the same paper and the same pattern and needed only someone to show them what it looked like when you put it all together. That was the thing, in the end, that she kept coming back to. Not the locked office or the dark estate or the 2 days on horseback or the hearing room in Cheyenne. Those were events. The thing underneath them, the thing that had actually made them possible, was simpler and less dramatic and more durable. She had looked carefully. She had shared what she found. And one by one, other people had done the same. That was it. That was all of it. The South Field would be ready to harvest in September. Silas had been talking about expanding the herd again in the fall, cautiously, the way he talked about anything that required optimism, as if optimism were a loan he wasn't sure he could service. She'd been nudging him toward it, not pushing, just keeping the question available. Ruth had decided recently and definitively that she wanted to learn how to read cattle the way Silas did, to look at the herd and see what it needed. She'd been following him around the property with this intention for 3 weeks, asking questions at a pace that had initially startled him and now seemed to have settled into something he was quietly not minding. Clara had started keeping her own notebooks, not about the ranch, about everything, people, conversations, things she observed. She would not say what the notebooks were for, which told Abigail everything about what they were for. One afternoon in late summer, Abigail stood at the Southfield fence and looked out over the wheat, which was coming up strong and even and very green in the August light. The mountains were visible in the distance, still capped white even at this time of year. The sky above them was enormous, the way Wyoming sky always was, the kind of scale that in the beginning had felt like exposure and now felt like room. She had not become someone different. That was the thing she'd needed to understand, the thing she'd gotten wrong in her first months here, when she'd felt the pressure to become something suited to this place, something tougher or more stoic or more comfortable with the harshness of frontier life. She was still the woman who kept every paper, who read things carefully, who made lists and timelines and charts and sat at kitchen tables until 2 in the morning assembling patterns from evidence, who could not be comfortable with injustice even when injustice was larger and better resourced than she was. That was not a handicap in Wyoming. It turned out not to be a handicap anywhere. She heard the gate behind her and turned. Silas was coming across from the barn with his hat pushed back on his head and his hands in his coat pockets. The particular walk of a man who is going somewhere specific but is not in a hurry about it. Ruth was 3 steps behind him, talking, gesturing at something in the field. And he was listening with the patient attention he'd developed for her questions. Not always understanding where they were going, but willing to go there. Abigail watched them come toward her. The wheat moved in a long wave in the afternoon wind. The mountains stood where they'd always stood. She turned back to the field for a moment, let herself simply look at it, the green of it, the evenness of it, the fact of it being there. Then she unlatched the gate to let them in.